In this lecture of the muscular system, we're going to talk about the characteristics of skeletal muscle. First, we have to remember that muscle is a unique tissue. And what makes muscle tissue unique is that it has the ability to contract or shorten in length when stimulated by an electrical impulse. And that electrical impulse, or action potential, will specifically come from a motor neuron. So in this illustration here, there are two motor neurons. One motor neuron is purple, and the other motor neuron is red. You can see that the purple motor neuron innervates two muscle fibers, and the red motor neuron innervates three muscle fibers. We call this interaction between a motor neuron and the muscle fibers a motor unit. And by definition, a motor unit is a motor neuron in all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. In other words, it's a motor neuron in all of the muscle fibers it connects to and stimulates. So now we're going to take a look at a muscle contraction from a graphical standpoint. In order to do this, we have to skin the leg of a frog, isolate the gastrocnemius or calf muscle, and attach that gastrocnemius to an electrical impulse. When we run an electrical current through that gastrocnemius, what's created is a muscle twitch. A muscle twitch is the contraction of a muscle in response to a stimulus that lasts only a few seconds. In other words, it's pretty quick, it's instantaneous. So here we see an electrical impulse traveling down a force transducer, and what ultimately is recorded is this muscle contraction called a twitch. A muscle contraction is recorded on a graph called a myogram. And on a myogram, along the y-axis will be the force of contraction, and along the x-axis will be time, or the duration. When we look at a muscle twitch, at some point, the muscle will be stimulated and a contraction will occur. So how can the force or the strength of a muscle contraction be increased? Well, it can increase in two ways. One way is by summation, and the second way is by recruitment. During summation, force of a contraction is increased by rapidly stimulating the muscle fibers. In other words, increasing the frequency of stimulation. So we have seen that if we have a single stimulation, we're going to get a muscle twitch. But what happens if we get multiple stimulations occurring successively, one right after the other? What we end up with are twitches that add upon one another or summate because previous twitches are never allowed to fully relax, resulting in an increase in force or strength of contraction. So here we take another look at what happens when we increase the frequency of stimulation. So here we have one stimulus and you get a twitch, multiple stimuli, and what we end up with is summation of twitches. The second way to increase the strength of a muscle contraction or the force of a muscle contraction is by recruitment. During recruitment, force of a contraction is increased by increasing the number of muscle fibers contracting by stimulating more motor units. So looking at this graphically, when we increase the size of the stimulus, we recruit more motor neurons, which increases the strength of the muscle contraction. So another way to look at this graphically is if we look at this illustration, we can see that motor unit number 1 innervates 2 muscle fibers. Motor unit number 2 innervates 3 muscle fibers. When motor unit number 1 is stimulated, it results in a particular force of contraction. When motor unit number 2 is stimulated, it too produces a certain force on a graph. But when we stimulate both motor unit number 1 and motor unit number 2, we get a larger force of contraction. For a muscle contraction to occur, it requires energy. So where does this energy come from? Energy comes from a process called cellular respiration. So recall that cellular respiration is the breakdown of a glucose molecule into ATP. ATP is the energy source for a muscle contraction. During a muscle contraction, whether it's increasing the frequency of the stimulus or increasing the strength of the stimulus, at some point in time, the muscle is going to reach its maximum strength for contraction. We call this tetanus. So by definition, tetanus is the maximum force of a sustained contraction with no relaxation period. At some point in time, the muscle contraction will rapidly decrease. This is known as muscle fatigue. And during muscle fatigue, ATP is used during a muscle contraction faster than it can be produced, and lactic acid builds up faster than it can be removed. So taking another look at a graph, here we have an increase in frequency of stimulus, and this generates a maximum force of contraction called tetanus, which results in fatigue, which is the depletion of ATP. Hopefully you understand that when muscles contract, they generate a force. So let's take a look at the two classifications of muscle fibers that help generate this force. The first type of muscle fiber is called a fast twitch fiber. The second type of muscle fiber is called a slow twitch fiber. Fast twitch fibers contract quickly, which means that they're used for explosive movements, and because of this, they fatigue quickly. Fast twitch fibers are also large storages for glycogen. Glycogen can be converted into glucose, and glucose is used during cellular respiration for the production of ATP. Fast twitch fibers undergo anaerobic metabolism, which means that they can break down glucose and form ATP in the absence of oxygen. And finally, fast twitch fibers have few myoglobin. Myoglobin is a protein that binds to oxygen, similar to hemoglobin found in the blood. So in the illustration, fast twitch fibers are the light colored fibers. And again, as I mentioned to you before, fast twitch fibers are used for explosive movements, such as those used in sprinting. And finally, the last type of fibers are the slow twitch fibers. Slow twitch fibers contract slowly, which means that they don't get tired as easily. In other words, they're fatigue resistant. Because slow twitch fibers don't get tired so easily, they have many mitochondria. Slow twitch fibers undergo aerobic metabolism, which means that they break glucose down in the presence of oxygen to form ATP. And finally, slow twitch fibers have many myoglobin, which means they need a constant source of oxygen. So in the illustration, slow twitch fibers are the dark fibers, and these fibers are best for endurance sports such as marathon running.